I grew up in a house where things weren't quite right. It wasn't a constant thing, but enough to let you know that something wasn't right. I was up in my room one day. It was summer and I was off from school. I was probably 14 or 15, and I had a drawer that was about 3 feet high and made to fit in a corner, which was where I had it. There was a small door on the wall that opened like an attic area. I had my stereo on top of the drawer and was listening to music. I kept hearing a vibrating noise. I got up to turn the stereo down so I could hear it, and it stopped. This happened a couple of times, with me turning down the stereo to hear the noise. Finally, after turning down the stereo again, I turned it back up and waited for the noise. Sure enough, it started, but I realized it was the door to the attic area that was vibrating. I naturally thought the stereo was causing this, so I turned it down and the vibrating door stopped. Then, suddenly, with the stereo still turned down, the door started shaking violently, like someone trying to get out. I ran downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. My mum was in the kitchen and said, "What? Did you see a ghost?" I was sleeping on the couch once more, again in the summer. It was hot, and the only air conditioner we had was in the living room, so I slept there to keep cool. I was sleeping with my face facing the back of the couch. I rolled over and saw my grandmother, who had passed away months before, bent over and wiping off our coffee table. She wasn't transparent or anything, it was just like seeing a real person in the darkened room. I closed my eyes tight, waited for a few minutes, and opened them again. She was gone. My brother slept upstairs. One night, he said he was laying in bed, trying to go to sleep. He heard someone come into his room. He had his back to the door, and we had hardwood floors, and he heard them squeaking. He said he rolled over, and there was this thing about 3 feet tall, covered in long hair, staring at him. Then he said it turned and ran out of the room, and he could hear its bare feet running down the hall. My mum was getting ready for bed one night, and my dad worked second shift and hadn't gotten home yet. My brother and I were in the living room watching TV. My mum said she was putting on her nightgown and turned around towards the window. The shade was up, maybe 4 inches, and she saw a very pale face with almost white eyes looking in at her. She stuck her tongue out at it, thinking it was my dad messing with her. She came in the living room and asked where our dad went. We told her he hadn't come home yet, and she freaked out, scared the hell out of us. One other time, my mum was in bed. Again, my father hadn't come home from work yet. The lights were off, and she heard someone come in the front door. The front door opened to the living room. Then there was kind of a U-shaped hallway that led to the kitchen and the back door. In the hallway were a bedroom, a bathroom, then another bedroom. My parents' bedroom was the first one, so my mum hears someone come in the front door. She thinks it's my dad. The big dark figure comes to her bedroom door and just stands there. All she could make out was a silhouette. She says something to it, thinking it's my dad. It lingers there for a moment, turns and goes down the hallway and out of the back door. A few minutes later, my dad came home and my mum asked him why he went out the back door. He hadn't been home and he didn't know what she was talking about. So he went outside to see if anyone was around, but found no one. There were other things, like my brother and I seeing a hat-wearing shadow on our bedroom door, and the door was slowly closing. We started screaming, and my dad came running upstairs to see what was wrong. We told him someone was shutting our door. Again, he looked around and found nothing. We moved out when I was 15 or so. I often wonder if the people who lived there after us had any experiences. In my childhood home, I've had plenty of unnerving things happen that I'd never tried to dwell on too much. Mainly because it was just a brief glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Plenty of weird sounds, mostly of women either singing or saying someone's name. I had 3 older siblings who also experienced stuff like this pretty regularly, but we never got too spooked out about it. The only instance that still gives me chills to this day is when me and my fiancée moved back into my childhood home to get away from a bad living situation we were in. It was just me, her, and our dog. We moved in and everything seemed fine. Nothing too crazy happens. Until one night, when I was in the kitchen playing with the dog, and I took off running to our laundry room area with the dog hot on my heels chasing me. I faced the opening and just stopped dead in my tracks, along with my dog. The opening to the laundry room was big. It had about an 8-foot high opening and probably 8 foot wide too. I looked up in the top right corner and seen this thing's head. Now, this isn't something I just caught a glimpse of. I made eye contact with this thing. It was peeking out of the top right corner, looking at me and my dog. Best way to describe it is how a mannequin looks. The bold ones, but bright white with no nose. Big solid black eyes and a mouth full of shark teeth. When it first emerged, I didn't see its teeth, but as I looked at it, its mouth opened and I saw them. That's when my dog decides to take off and I'm right behind him. This all happens in the span of maybe 10 or 15 seconds. We've since moved out, but lived there for maybe a year after that, and my dog refused to go near the laundry room after that. I know it's kind of hard to believe. Hell, I'd be skeptical too if I didn't see it with my own eyes. Just wanted to share my experience and see if anyone has had a similar run-in with whatever that thing could have been. I'm the youngest of 3, with 2 older brothers. My middle brother had passed away in 2005, and one of my cousins had given birth to a boy a few years later, so he's never seen or heard of my brother before. Fast forward a few years more, when the boy is old enough to talk, I think like 5. I guess my aunt was telling my mum that her son has an imaginary friend that he's been talking about named Michael. Now both my aunt and my mum played it off as kids will be kids sort of thing. That was until my aunt began explaining this imaginary friend and how it had some coincidental things that directly related to my brother. Firstly, this Michael would wake up the boy at night wanting to play basketball. The kid didn't mind because he liked basketball too, but it was in the middle of the night. Secondly, Michael tells him he has an owie and points to his throat. I'll get back to this later. Then the trippy part comes when my mum went to visit my aunt. She was sitting on the couch watching TV while my cousin and her son walked in. Her son was hesitant at first and then walked back to his room. My cousin went to my mum and told her. He was being shy because he told me that is Michael's mum. I was then told that if you show him a photo of my brother, he points to it and says, "That's Michael." Even when I went to their house, the boy did the same thing, and this time, the cousin said, He whispered to me saying that's Michael's brother. Here's the kicker. My brother's first name is Travis, and his middle name is Michael. He liked to play basketball in high school, and he died from a freak accident at some sand dunes while riding an ATV. It shattered his Adam's apple, and he basically suffocated. When I was a senior in high school, my mum and I went to the Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. I knew nothing about it, except that my aunt wrote a paper on it for her psychology class, and it was supposed to be really interesting. The museum itself is a separate, newer building with the actual old hospital next door. The exhibit has a bunch of equipment and patients' belongings from when the psychiatric hospital was running in the early 1900s. So there was a lot of creepy relics from the golden days of messed up therapy methods and procedures. However, none of this really bothered me. A side note, the museum also has separate exhibits about Native American tribes local to the area and the Pony Express. We entered the main floor, nothing too interesting, just a gift shop and little displays. I felt fine until we reached the second floor where the psychiatric exhibit began. As soon as the doors opened, there was a figure in my mind's eye. I didn't physically see the figure. It looked kind of like a Death Eater from Harry Potter, only not as big and without a head. It followed us around the floor, through the psychiatric exhibit, and eventually stopped. I told my mum to keep her feelings to herself so I wouldn't have a biased experience. I looked at the items left behind by former patients. I felt a presence telling me not to touch any of them or something bad would happen. Finally, we made it to the Native American exhibit, and the figure was there again. It followed us but stayed about 20 feet behind, stopping when we stopped. We took the elevator to the morgue area in the basement. You'd think I'd feel something. Nope, nothing. Finally, we went to the main floor and left. When we got home, I mentioned to my mum it felt like something was following us. She agreed and said she saw it too. I decided to do a test. I had us face away from each other and draw what we thought it looked like. Turns out we drew the exact same thing. After that, I emailed the museum and told them what I had experienced. I didn't think they'd write back, but they did. They told me what I had experienced was actually a very common occurrence amongst their guests and staff, and they have allowed investigations from time to time. So, yeah, Glore Psychiatric Museum. So I grew up in Northern Virginia, and we had plenty of battlefields and such to visit for school field trips. In 5th grade, my class went to the Bell Grove plantation, which was at Cedar Creek battlefield. Cool house, still has damage to her columns from gunfire from the battle. Anywho, my class was in the kitchen of the plantation, listening to the tall lady talk about whatever it is you'd tell a bunch of 10-year-olds about plantation life. There are these big double doors on each side of the room, and they're open, and then we hear humming coming from outside. The teacher's aide, who I'll call Bulldog because she looks like one, told us that whoever was humming to knock it off. But that's the thing, it wasn't any of us, and it was coming from outside. Bulldog goes out one side of the kitchen, comes back in, and goes out the side that leads to the garden. She comes back in and says to the tall lady, no one at all is out there. but she could hear the humming right there in the garden. Doesn't sound like much, right? Well, fast forward a few years, and I'm reading a Ghosts of Virginia book. There's a story about Belle Grove in it. Apparently, the lady of the house was found in the smokehouse one day, badly beaten, half in the embers, with clear fist prints on her face. She died just a few days later. A slave girl was accused of the beating and murder and was hanged for it. And the lady of the house liked to walk in the garden and was always humming, and various people over the years was witness, I guess you could say, to the ethereal humming that would take place in the garden. That just thoroughly freaked me out when I realized I got to witness it too. So when I was 14, my dad died. No need to be sad about it, he was an ass. When he was alive, he would sneak up on people and scare the hell out of them. One of the ways he'd do that was to just silently creep up and chill out in the corner of your vision until you realized there was an asshole staring at you. After he passed away, I'd be sitting in the living room watching TV, and I would see him just glide up in the corner of my vision across the room and stand and stare at me from the front entryway. I'd look over and poof, nothing there. Now, this could easily be written off as me being tired, mind playing tricks on me, etc. But that isn't all of it. Dad loved to watch history and nature shows, and this was back when the History, Discovery and AE channels actually played decent docs and biographies and the like. He was an insomniac, so he'd always be up late with one of these channels on. And the walls were incredibly thin, and I'd always have to beg him to turn the damn thing down so I could sleep when I was a kid. After he died, for a few months at least once a week, I'd be in bed, and all of a sudden, hear the TV in the living room, and it would be on a documentary on ants or a biography of Churchill or other things. It definitely spooked me. My brother wasn't doing it, because for one, he's deaf, and if he were to watch TV, he'd mute it. And also, he has his own TV. My mum worked nights, and it always happened when she wasn't home. And at this point, my sister had been living on her own for quite some time. I'd get up to see what happened. Maybe the cat had turned the TV on, yeah? But nope. Max the tuxedo was usually with me in bed or outside. And I'd be able to hear the TV drone on about worker ants as I made my way down the hallway, through the kitchen and dining room to the front entryway. And once again, I'd get to the spot where I could see the living room and the TV. All noise would cease. It'd be dead silent, so quiet you could probably hear a spider fart. But wait, there's more. After he passed, the locked, chained and dead-bolted front door would open all on its own and let the cat in. This one happened in front of everyone at differing points over the winter after dear old Dad had kicked the bucket. But the thing that really got me is this event I'm about to tell you about. I was down in the basement one night watching TV. My mum was home and in the living room. Whenever she needed me, she'd stomp on the floor to get my attention. And that night, she stomped something furious. I raced upstairs, and she's sitting in a chair with a wooden TV tray table in front of her. On the table was a styrofoam cup, and it was shaking violently. There were no open windows, there were no fans. I picked up the cup and checked it for wires and strings. Absolutely nothing was attached to it making the damn thing move. I put it back on the table, and it would shake again. Mum, of course, is saying it had to be Dad doing it, and nothing else. The creepy visions, the cat coming through a bolted and chained front door. and the documentaries about ants being heard at all hours of the night freaked me out as much as that damn cup freaked me out. I knew my mum wasn't doing it. I checked and double-checked. The table was perfectly flat on the floor, didn't wobble. There wasn't a way to make that cup move, and not even the table itself. It just thoroughly spooked me out, and Mum kept saying it had to be Dad. He was a trickster. So I shout out, "If this is you, Dad, knock it the hell off." And it stopped. I didn't even finish saying it when the cup stopped shaking. After the cup incident, the cat had to wait for a real live human to open the door for him. I heard no more documentaries in the middle of the night, and I didn't even see Dad creep in the corner of my vision to stare at me. When I was 16, I started dating this guy, let's call him Joe, and he and his friends like to do the whole ghost hunting thing in abandoned properties. This was back before shows like Ghost Hunters made it into mainstream culture. There was one they were very fond of. When we talked about the house, we'd try to call it by the name of the road it was on, but in the interest of trying to keep some anonymity, I'm gonna keep it to myself. So I'd only been dating Joe for a few weeks, and one weekend, he and I, along with 2 other friends, decided to mosey on over to this house and check it out. Now, the story that everyone believed about this house was that this guy snapped one day, killed his brother in the barn, and then took an axe and went through the house and killed his wife and children. Inside the house on the 2nd floor, some walls did appear to have been chopped out with an axe. It's unclear why he did this. Some say his wife and brother were having an affair, kids weren't really his, etc. And just to get this out of the way, I did try to find out the history of the place, but I never found anything to prove any of it happened. But its history, well, I'm not sure if it had anything to do with the things that happened here. So anyway, we go, and we hang out and dick around checking the place out. Nothing happens. Boring, I know. But that night, long after I left, I dreamt that I was in the barn of the property. Our friend, who I'll call Anthony, because he looked like Anthony Kiedis from RHCP, was with me. And there was this guy standing in front of me, telling me I could ask him any questions I wanted and take pictures. But Anthony kept getting in my way and asking stupid stuff. All I got from that dream was that this guy said he was a ghost. He liked to haunt the barn, and he was wearing a plaid flannel shirt with overalls, wearing a type of baseball hat, and he only had one arm. The next day, I see Joe and I tell him about it. I describe what the ghost was wearing, and then Joe looks at me pretty hardly and asks me if the ghost was missing an arm. What? Yes, he was, Joe. How the hell did you know? Joe says his sister would see the man exactly as I described and missing an arm at night hanging out in the hallway of their house when she was a kid, talking to a couple of other men. Apparently, she would get up to use the bathroom at night. She sees these guys standing at the end of the hallway, and they'd be gone by the time she's come out of the bathroom. I hadn't met her at that point, and years later, when she and I got to talking one day, I asked her about it, and she confirmed she did see an armless man all the time as a kid. But wait, it gets a little bit more weird. Joe and I had another friend, Tina. Tina had a little boy, and they lived with her parents in another town, but also somewhat close to the axe murder house. Her little boy would say there was a man in the basement of their house that kept talking to him. One day, he draws this man, and guess what he drew? I have no idea if this thing was a ghost or what, but the fact that 3 different people saw him in some way, years apart, but always looks the same, just genuinely creeps me out. The other story with that house, oh man, one night, total spur of the moment decision, we decide to head up to the house because, for one, we had enough people to cover all the areas of the house and barn, and two, one of us had a van so we could take one vehicle. We had never had that many go at once because, well, when you do things like this, it's best not to have 4 cars parked in an abandoned house's driveway. So there was 10 of us this time, 2 in the basement, 2 on the first floor, 2 on the second, 2 in the attic, and 2 in the barn. At this point, I'd been to this house numerous times. I had been through the whole thing and knew it as well as my own house. And I was not on drugs, had nothing to drink that night. That's important. So Joe and I, we end up as the 2 who get to hang out on the second floor. Except there's something I'd never seen before. This is going to sound so stupid, but I swear on all my loved ones, it's true. There was a bathroom there that I had never seen before. Seriously, I had never seen this bathroom before. And it connected between 2 bedrooms. And it was big, with a giant claw-footed tub. It would be really hard to miss, you know? It freaked me the hell out, and everyone agreed that we'd hang out on our assigned floor for at least 20 minutes. And Joe made us spend that time in that bathroom. I was seriously wondering if it would fade out of existence with me in it. It didn't, thank God. But I went back one last time to that house. I went with other friends that time, and no Joe. We went through that house again and again, and seriously, that bathroom was gone. I went through every doorway and every hole in the wall and double-checked all closets. And that room was just gone, like it had never been there. I still don't know how to explain this. I really wish I had been drunk or on drugs that night. My mum passed away this past fall, so I flew back to my hometown and stayed at my sister's for a few weeks while we tried to get things settled and all that. The first part is my niece, who's 9, says she had a dream about her grandma, and that grandma had said she loved all of her kids and grandkids. Pretty standard common thing that happens with kids when loved ones pass away. And then one day, I decided to lay down in my sister's bedroom because it wasn't the damn bunk bed I had been sleeping in, and it wasn't the living room where my brother had to set up camp. So I'm laying there, my back is to the open door, and I'm on the laptop messing around on Reddit. And then something slaps me on the arse. I whip around, no one's there. Only person in the house besides me is Big Bro, who's just not the silent creep up on you type, mostly because he's deaf and has no idea how loud he is. If I hadn't been wide awake and reading submissions over in writing prompts, I would believe it was a hypnic jerk or a form of hypnagogic hallucination, like with sleep paralysis, but I only ever get those when I'm flat on my back. I tell my sis about it later. Then she relates the story of how one day she came home and just stretched out on the couch and had what felt like someone jabbing their finger into her shoulder. She said she turned every which way, and no matter what, she got a finger jab. So maybe they got confused and thought I was her, I don't know. And then I fly back home, and I'm with my SO in our bedroom, and I'm telling him that it didn't seem fair that all the weird stuff happened when my dad died. Yet nothing happened to me with my mum. And there's all these people who relate their pennies from heaven stories, where they keep finding change and are convinced it's from their dead loved ones. And I joke that it'd be nice if mum did that, but with paper money. As I'm saying that, I reach for my PJs that are in a basket of freshly laundered clothes. and money falls out of them. It's 10 $1 bills, crisp, brand spanking new. The serial numbers on them are also in order. And it came from the basket of clothes I had just pulled out of the dryer not even half an hour earlier. Anyone who's ever washed paper money, at least US money, knows that it would not still be crisp and brand new. It would feel weird. These bills didn't have that. They even still smelled new, like they were just printed. Thanks, Mum. This happened about 8 or so years ago, around Thanksgiving at my grandma's house. Everyone was asleep except for me. The only people in the house were my grandparents, my mum, my brother and me. No one else. I was on the computer because I couldn't sleep. I turned on a small TV to watch Adult Swim while I browsed the internet. Around 4:30, I started getting a chill up my spine, and I heard some children laugh, distinctly the voices of a little girl and boy. I know I'm all by myself, as far as being awake, so I turned to look at the TV, and it was in the middle of an Inuyasha fight sequence, so there's no way the laughter was coming from that. I checked the computer sound settings, and I had every possible output muted, so it wasn't that either. I sat there confused for a few moments, while the giggling of the two children were playing in the background. I figured maybe the radio in the kitchen was on. It was digital, so maybe it just came on for some reason, or it had a timer. I got up, and I kid you not, as I walked to the door, with each step, the laughter grew louder, from giggling to guffaws of hard laughter. Once the guffaws started, I started to hear a baby cry as well. What's going through my mind now is, what the hell kind of radio show is this? And I just took 3 steps, nowhere near the door. I took a few more steps, and the laughter turned hysterical, if not maniacal. The baby cries turned to screams and wails, as if it were in pain. I was trembling and terrified with each step I took to the doorway. But my mind was on autopilot. I needed to get out of there and across the hall to my mum, who surely would help me and notice the weird sounds too. The last couple of steps increased the laughter and crying to an almost deafening decibel. It was like I was at a concert and the speakers were directly in my ears blasting noise. It was painful and it scared the hell out of me. I took all the courage I had, and as soon as I reached the doorway, I was going to sprint. I started to run, but then something shoved me. I felt these hands on my chest pushing me back into the room with enough force to throw me off balance. The crying and laughter stopped as soon as I was back in the room. This all happened within 20 to 30 seconds, but it felt like 10 minutes. I was so scared I cried and slept in the tiny armchair before my grandma came in the room and made me sleep in her bed downstairs. I told my grandma about this, and she told me a few stories about how she knew her place was haunted. Apparently, when I was a baby, the ghosts or whatever they were would take care of me and play with me. I would always look past whoever was holding me to play peekaboo with someone who wasn't there. My mum even told me a story about how when I was maybe a year old, I woke her up crying, as babies do. And as soon as she got to the room, she saw the dial on the mobile hanging above the crib turn by itself, and I had stopped crying and tried to reach someone who was supposedly standing there. After the screaming baby and laughing children, I had experienced a few more things over the years at that house that aren't explainable. In fact, the morning after my grandma found me on the armchair, she sent me down to the basement where her bed is so I could at least nap comfortably for a couple of hours. But as soon as I got down there, I just got this weird feeling, kind of sick to my stomach. I could feel someone watching me, so I just turned the hallway light on and tried to sleep with that for a nightlight since I was still spooked. It's important to note that they had those dimmer switches, not the traditional on-off switches for their lights. I laid there in bed for a few minutes before getting the bone-chilling cold. I couldn't stop myself from looking up towards the hallway where I had the light on, and I watched in frozen horror as the light flicked on and off multiple times, and each time, I swear on my life, I saw a shadow figure of someone clearly standing in a way to stare at me. I couldn't even begin explaining the level of terror that I felt. Like every cell of your brain is screaming, but it overloads you, so you're stuck there until your mind reboots enough for you to move. I tore ass up the stairs and didn't sleep that day. Another memorable one has to be when I lived with her about 4 years ago. She gave me my own room, and very often I would wake up to someone jiggling the door handle on the door next to my bed. I've caught it moving on its own a couple of times. One morning when I lived there, I remember being woken up around 4:30, 5 a.m. with this constant knocking sound, like someone was hitting my wall with a hammer outside. That side of the house has a very narrow place that my cousins and I would play hide and seek in when we were little, so I figured maybe Grandpa was doing some early morning repairs or something. Turns out, Grandpa didn't wake up until 9 or so that morning, so I have no idea who or what was knocking on my wall. It was almost in a pattern of 3. That's what I remember, and it freaks me out. There was even a night my cousin and I slept in the living room of that house, and she woke me up, panicking and crying, saying she saw a man staring at us in the window. I was like 12 and she was 9. So I got up and saw the shape of a man in the curtains. I froze for a second until my cousin whimpered again, so I shoved the curtain aside to show her no one was there. And there was no one there. There couldn't have been anyone there. Outside the window was like 3 inches of room. Then my grandma's giant ferns were there. Literally not enough room for anyone to stand in the window. When I closed the curtain, no shadow was there anymore, and I had to hold her until she fell asleep. I'm a male living in the UK. I'm an atheist and feel that I apply an appropriate level of skepticism about all things in life. I strongly believe that everything must meet its burden of proof before it's to be accepted, based on how extraordinary something is, and how well it fits into the real world we can observe and test. That being said, there are a great many people that, if you were to ask if they saw a ghost or something paranormal, they would say no. But then, after thinking on it for a while, would say, actually, there is something or things that I can't explain. Something that I wouldn't jump to a conclusion about, but still, nonetheless, would be unable to explain. I have a few small things that fall into this category that when put together might be worth saying. Starting with my mum telling me that as a baby, I'd look over her shoulder behind and grin at something, which really gave her the creeps, as this apparently coincided with some other weird things happening, like stuff being moved. As a young kid, maybe around 6, my mum, brother and I travelled to stay with our grandmother who lived a few hours away. She was widowed in the 60s and never remarried. My brother would take a spare room and I'd sleep in my grand's bed. One morning, I woke up to something digging into my sides, just like when someone digs their 2 fingers in either side of your ribs to make you jump. I opened my eyes, and no one else was in the room. My gran was already up and downstairs. I didn't know what to make of it, and kind of brushed it off and closed my eyes again. But then, as I did, it happened again. This time, I shot up and decided that whatever it was time to get up. Being so young, I didn't tell anyone. I just didn't know what to make of it. It had never happened before, and it's never happened since. When I was a few years older, I had a few experiences where my name would be shouted at me or slowly whispered as I was dozing off, and I'd jump awake, freaked out and wondering who was responsible. There is a condition called exploding head syndrome, not nearly as terrible as it sounds. It's more like, as you're going to sleep and your brain starts to work, you can get these experiences, which, at least for this, I feel like I can kind of put it down to, but still I can't be sure. One time at school, while walking in the busy corridor to my next lesson, someone's hand met my shoulder from behind as they were trying to walk by. Immediately, someone's face jumped into my mind. At that point, I turned and saw that it was the same kid. I didn't know this kid or have ever spoken to him. I just knew his face from seeing him around the school occasionally. That I really can't explain, as I was facing the other way the whole time. Finally, fast forward to the age of about 18 or 19. My girlfriend at the time was staying over at my house, and we had to get up early to drive into the city through country roads so I could drop her back to her house and head on into work for the early Saturday shift. I lived out of town, and I was a key holder at work, so had to get going around 5:30, and it was still dark. So driving on the country road, there was some white smoke or fog in the middle of the road. It was kind of the shape and size of a person, and there was no fog anywhere else, just localized, in the middle of the road. It looked very out of place, like I've never seen fog appear that way before. It happened all too quick, and we drove right through it. We both freaked out, and she didn't want me to leave for work when we got to hers, but I had to. I do think that if anyone really thinks carefully enough, more often than not, they will come up with something that they just can't explain. And that's why I find these kinds of things fascinating. So, I work in a haunted daycare. My personal story happened while I worked with the 9 to 18-month babies. At nap time, they all sleep in their own cribs, and the teachers all huddle in the furthest corner, so the kids will stay asleep. One day, the kids are all asleep, which is a feat in itself. So I'm sitting facing the room at large, talking to my co-worker. As I'm checking the room, a ball that was left out rolled across the floor. Just straight up moved 4 feet across the floor. It didn't start anywhere near a baby, and even if it had, they were all asleep. The ball was slightly deflated and even sounded like someone tried to grab it. That sound of fingers trying to find purchase on rubber. Now, normally I'd attribute this to a trick of the light or the AC kicking on. But my co-worker, who had been looking at me, turned her head at the sound and said, "What was that?" I told her what I'd seen. We had a nervous chuckle, and we asked the ghost to kindly not wake any of the kids. Other co-workers have felt taps when no one's behind them, have seen things move on their own, and one even saw something too tall and abstract to be a kid run down the hallway, only to disappear. I'm a 24-year-old female, but was about 15 at the time of this, and my friend was 16 at the time. We used to go to this horse barn after school. She would go every day to muck out the stalls, to work off the board for her horse to stay there. It was not a huge barn. It has probably 16 stalls, but maybe 12 horses actually boarded there. The building was like a straight line, with the front entrance pointing towards the road, and the other end pointing towards the paddocks. It was easy to know if someone pulled up because the entrance was literally right next to the road, and the car headlights would shine through the whole barn. Anyway, my friend and I'll call her Mandy, were sitting in the tack room with the door open, waiting for my dad to pick us up. This was in the winter in New Hampshire, and it gets dark by like 3:30, 4 p.m. during that time, so it was pretty dark out besides some lights in the barn. We're just sitting there, talking, when suddenly I hear someone yell my name. "Hannah?" Like a question. I didn't say anything about it for about 10 seconds when Mandy says, "Did someone just call your name?" I knew I wasn't crazy then. I said yes, and we both peeked out the tack room door. The voice sounded exactly like my dad, but there were no headlights in the driveway, and we were the only ones there. I called my dad, and he was about 20 minutes out. I want to add earlier in the day we were bringing the horses in from the paddocks, and this horse was like 25 years old and bomb-proof as hell. He refused to go inside to the point he actually knocked Mandy over and ran back out. It took 10 minutes to get him in. We both have wondered for years what this meant. It's my one and only encounter with the paranormal, and now it's been almost 10 years. I sometimes question myself if this actually happened, but I know that it did because my friend experienced it with me. In about 2012 or 2013, my neighbor passed away. She was originally from the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, but moved to my town with her husband to start a life and a family here. She and her family lived just up the road from my family for decades. I never personally had any experiences with her, but my father never had anything but good things to say about her. She was nice, polite, and all round a great neighbor. I'm not sure when her husband passed, or when her son moved away, but for most of my lifetime, she lived alone. She always spoke about how our hollow was very full of spirits. The hollow was just a road with numerous houses that are generally spread apart. This is common in rural areas like the place where I live. She told my father about how she spoke with them regularly, and this was something that he never even questioned. He fully believed her. Anyway, when she passed, she left a home and a small wooden cabin. I'm not going to lie, as a curious 13-year-old, my fellow 14-year-old neighbor and I went into the cabin, which was unlocked. We didn't touch anything or mess with any of her stuff, but we did see a book that was unusual. We later found out it was in fact a spell book, but I can't for the life of me remember what it was called. After her house sat for a month or longer, slowly decaying, her son came to clean it out and take the things that he wanted. They left a huge portable dumpster with some of the things that he didn't want to take with him. He told my father that we were more than welcome to look through it and take anything that we wanted. Of course, we went to have a look. While looking, I saw the most beautiful coat rack. It looked like a tree without leaves. The branches were where you could place your jackets, and for some reason, I really wanted it. We took the coat rack home, and that was that. A few days later, I was up getting a snack. It was dark outside, and I went to our kitchen pantry to find a snack. While looking for something to eat, I glanced over at the glass window panes in our screened-in porch that is right next to our kitchen. When I looked up, I saw a black silhouette of a woman with long hair standing outside of the window. I know for a fact that it wasn't my reflection because I have medium-length hair and I was facing the palm tree, so I was sideways to the window. The figure was standing facing the window forward and the hair went down over its shoulders. Obviously, I screamed and ran to tell my mother, but she didn't believe me. I told my father and he actually mentioned that this could have been the spirit of my neighbour wanting her coat rack back. When I mentioned that the figure had long hair, he told me that in her younger days, she had long beautiful black hair. This shook me to my core. A couple of days later, my father was standing in the kitchen when he heard the sound of someone knocking on the same window. My dog also heard the knocking and began growling at the window. My dad went to look, but saw no one around. Our backyard, where the window faces, is nothing but forest, and the closest house is about a quarter of a mile away and backed up onto a hill. There couldn't have been anyone that did this. Not but a few days later, my mother was working on a puzzle in the screened-in porch area, sitting right next to the window in question, and she heard scratching on the screen covering. She also saw nothing, but immediately left the room. We also experienced our TV's volume being turned all the way up when no one had the remotes, and objects being moved to random places where we didn't leave them. I didn't know if this was my neighbour, but I do know that we got rid of the coat rack and have not experienced anything since. My aunt actually took the object and sold it in a church yard sale. I wish I knew where it was and what happened to it, but I guess I'll never know. Ever since, I don't take or buy any second-hand objects. The story I'm about to tell is something I've generally kept to myself for the past 30-odd years. When I was approximately 14 or 15 years old, circa 1988-89, myself and my family had 2 summer holidays in the Algarve in Portugal, one following on from the previous year. The first holiday included myself, my older sister, mum and dad, and an uncle and an aunt. The second holiday, the following summer, was the same people except my sister who stayed at home. Both holidays were in the same location, and both times we stayed in the same villa, which was owned by a business associate of my uncle. As such, I believe the accommodation was free, and that's why it was a great holiday option for us all. The villa was situated about a 15-minute walk outside of a well-known Algarve town called Carvoeiro. The first holiday, where my sister was also present, was event-free, and nothing unexplained happened at all. The second holiday was where I alone experienced an absolutely terrifying paranormal event which has stayed with me to this day. The villa we stayed in was all on one level, as most villas are, and had a pretty standard layout. The main door at the front led straight into the kitchen, and that led into the main lounge area. Off to the left and the right of the main lounge was 2 ensuite bedrooms, where my parents and uncle and aunt slept. I slept on a fold-out bed in the lounge area, and out to the back of the property was a small swimming pool. From memory, it was a very nice, spacious villa, and probably worth quite a bit of money. Nothing happened for the entire 2-week period that we were there, except for the final night of the holiday. I often say, thank God we flew home the next morning, because I don't think I could have stayed there another night. On this final evening, everyone had just gone to bed and closed their doors, and I had just finished setting up my bed and finally turned out the lights, and got into bed. No longer than 30 seconds after getting into bed, I started to hear tapping on one of the walls. I laid there trying to guess what it might be and just figured it was probably one of my parents or uncle and aunt doing something in their rooms, so just ignored it. I then heard the same tapping again, but louder. I sat up in the bed and tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, peering across the dimly lit lounge room. Sitting up is how I know it wasn't sleep paralysis, as some people have often suggested to me. It was then that the tapping started to spin around the room, as if the knocking was circling me as I sat there. This was naturally pretty unnerving, and I struggled to rationalize what was happening. It was at this point that the tapping stopped, and immediately, a wooden chair from the lounge room dining table made a scraping sound against the wooden parquet flooring that it was resting on. The sort of scraping noise a chair would make if you pulled it out from under a table to sit on it. At this point, I didn't know what was going on. And being as young as I was, I think fear got the better of me, and I shot down into the bed. Turning around, I'm pulling the sheets under my chin and close to my eyes. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. Next, I heard more scraping as dining chairs were being moved, followed by a very quiet but distinctive shuffling noise, which sounded like shuffling footsteps. These footsteps got louder, as whatever it was started to approach me in the room. As it approached, I then heard this mumbling, in what sounded like guttural, low-key talking, but in a language I didn't understand. It certainly wasn't Portuguese. On top of this mumbling, I suddenly began to hear this terrifying rasping breathing, in and out in a very rhythmic fashion, the sort of rasping that someone with severe breathing difficulty would make. This breathing got louder and louder until it was right behind me, right next to my head, on the pillow, rasping loudly into my right ear. Petrified doesn't even cut it. I was simply frozen with fear. I don't think I could have turned around, even if I wanted to. This loud, heavy breathing continued for what seemed like a lifetime, but in reality was probably about 30 or 40 seconds. And then it slowly faded away, and the room was left in silence. I laid in the bed for about another hour, unable to sleep, and listening intently for anything else. But there was nothing. Eventually I fell asleep, probably through nervous exhaustion, and when I next woke up, it was 6 a.m. and daylight filled the room. And I remember the sheer feeling of relief. The first thing I did was get up and look at the dining table area. And sure enough, 2 chairs had been moved away from their normal resting positions under the table, and not just by a small amount, but significantly so. I also checked the rest of the communal areas in the villa to see if any doors or windows had been left open, but there was nothing. When my family got up, I told them all what had happened, and unfortunately, I was met with mainly skepticism, which I found a little upsetting at the time. To be honest, I think the experience affected me to the degree where I probably needed a form of counselling to really process it and help get over it. But of course, nothing like that was available at the time. I have often tried to rationalize or debunk this event myself over the years. Did a wild animal get into the property and then prowl around doing these things? Possibly, but that wouldn't explain how it would have left again as the property was secure. Or more importantly, wouldn't explain the circling tapping or the mumbling dialect. Was it one of the family members sleepwalking? I've thought about this a lot too, and concluded that it's just not possible, as I would have heard them opening their bedroom doors, which were heavy wood and very loud, and there simply wouldn't have been enough time for them to fall asleep, as it happened very quickly after they all retired to their rooms. A few people I've shared this story with have suggested it could have been something demonic in nature, but I'm not sure if that would be true or not. An interesting fact to end on is years later, fairly recently actually, I discussed this with my sister, who then told me when she was with us during the first holiday, she always felt extremely uneasy sleeping in the villa lounge, and often would get up and sleep with my parents in their room. She also told me she was informed by my parents and uncle that the property, which was built on old former wasteland, was actually on the grounds of a former mass grave/burial site. This was something they decided to keep from telling me, as I was the youngest at the time. I thought that was interesting, and depending on what your beliefs are, it could maybe go some way to explaining the strange events that took place. As a result of this experience, I've always been extremely open-minded about the paranormal, and if I'm honest, have always had a very inquisitive interest in it. I think this is how it goes for most people who have experienced something. And I know they often say that everyone's a skeptic until you experience something yourself. When you do, it changes everything. It certainly did for me.